Looking at the topic of the business of education, one of the things that really came to mind in our discussions when we were preparing for this was how much education has changed. I'm old enough, as my greying temples will confirm, to remember when education was a bit of a conveyor belt. You had primary school, secondary school, university, for as long as you could survive before being kicked out into the real world, kicking and screaming to try and earn a living. Um, it's not like that anymore. So Ryan, you're on the sharp end of this. How's it changed?
Yeah, really good question, Barry. Sometimes we come to these sort of education forums and we have to sort of scramble together. Well, has the industry evolved or been disrupted in the last 6 or 12 months? And we point to some small anecdotal things as though they're seismic events. I don't think we'll have much or we'll have anything to struggle to talk about here in terms of what the education sector has gone through in the last 6 months. A transformation as great in a sort of half-year period as any that it's had in its entire history of delivery and teaching and learning. So you mentioned around the business of education there. Well, you don't need to be in the business of education to know that this sector has rapidly changed. You just need to have a child. Um, that's enough. And any of us who has a child, whether they're 4, 14, or anywhere in between, will know how disruptive the last 6 months have been. I myself have a child in childcare, and then someone and my daughter's in prep, and yeah, she sits. Her experience of school is sitting in front of a screen, putting her hand up, hoping that a teacher will see her in amongst a sea of small tiles of small children. And none of us, whether it was you, Barry, myself, James, any one of us, or even anyone from 2018 earlier, would have experienced schooling like that. So whilst we've dramatically shifted at the, as you put it, the sharp end, and we've had to adapt and pivot very, very quickly, so has everyone, even those who aren't directly tied to an education business. In terms of those of us in the commercial side of things, it's been absolutely transformative. We as a business are very fortunate in that we operate exclusively in online education. So you could say this has been all our Christmases at once coming together, and in many ways it's been a very positive time for us from a ease of use and a transition perspective, because this is the area we work in. But we are one part of an equation. We work directly in collaboration with universities who are, you pick up a newspaper or you watch the news at any point in time in the day, who are dramatically suffering right now, whether it's in Australia, in the UK, in the US, doesn't really matter. They're all going through a very trying and traumatic time, be that through access to support from the government, the international student flows, and just being unable to have students on campus. So it's an incredibly challenging time, Ari, and I think everyone's just had to be agile, respond as quick as and as best they can, whilst having a view on, well, what is this sector going to look like 6, 12 months, 24 months time from now, and how do we best set ourselves up and prepare for that. So looking forward to the discussion around that today, and acknowledging that we're all, none of us have great answers for a lot of this, and we're all going to have to work together to make it as good as we can, whether it's for a 4-year-old or a 24-year-old.
Well, that's a fair point. And, just for our attendees, if you have any questions that you want to ask Ryan and James in the run, please use the Q&A or the chat function, and we'll moderate those questions for you. I've had a few questions that have been sent by people who couldn't join at this specific time but want to be in the discussion as well. So I guess in a unprecedented scenario in the market, it takes a brave man to launch a completely new product. James, you guys did that. In our last session, there were a few comments that, how did you know? Because you just seemed to arrive with the right product at the right time in terms of a very sudden change around sort of micro credentials, digital badges. Talk to us about that.
Sure. Look, we recognised quite early on that that sort of quest for recognising sort of smaller sort of soft skills, etc., was something that was needed in the market. We already saw that there were a few players out there. One of the things that we try to do is work really closely with our university partners, understand their business, understand some of the challenges that they face, and try to sort of help that to feed our sort of product roadmap. And badges and micro credentials have been spoken a lot about at conferences, at universities, etc., events. And so there was a lot of sort of, I suppose, misinformation around it. And so our product team are quite good at sort of then taking those requirements and starting to build something specific. We also saw that there was a need for students to be able to have a single repository, not only for their I suppose larger awards, degrees, etc., but to have a single repository where they could also have a repository for things like their badges for soft skills earned during their degrees, such as leadership, communication, etc. And then the students would be able to share those badges earned also with their degrees to put their, I suppose, best foot forward when seeking employment. And so it was kind of a bit serendipitous, actually, that it just all sort of seemed to coincide with the COVID-19.
You guys certainly seem to be Johnny on the spot whenever we were in the first lockdown. For those of us in Victoria, we're in the new improved version of it. But while everyone was stuck at home after March, and those who chose not to spend weeks developing a sourdough starter were diving headlong into online education, you guys were there to be able to legitimize that. And I guess one of the things we talked about, and I'll bring you in on this, Ryan, is how there's been that sort of democratization in terms of education, where maybe that traditional provider has been disrupted, and there is education available in many places of varying quality. What have you seen with that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So one of the disappointing things about higher education is that we don't, as a global uniform sector, share data that well. So you have to pick up on sort of data pieces where they exist. I was having a look yesterday at the MOOC world, which we all sort of know and are reasonably familiar with, which is so broad access to open educational courses from universities around the world. And the top three providers there, Coursera, edX, and one or two others, had the same amount of enrollments in the month of April as they did in the entirety of 2018. So what we saw pretty quickly was, rather than students who traditionally would have gone to a university, be it on campus or for a short course or even something unaccredited, was them not waiting for COVID to pass, the gates to open back up again, and take another 6 or 12 months until things go by. So students really sort of drove their own learning and their own initiative. And one of the fascinating things within that is, if you delve into the data, the areas of specific course and learning interest were absolutely top of the tree were professional and personal development. So it wasn't that people were sort of, and you could assume that this was a mixture of students who, or people who were in employment, or even people who may have lost their job, unfortunately, that the first thing they decided to do was upskill and reskill. Now, if resources and platforms and online education like this hadn't been available, what would people have done? Because there isn't a university to go to, there wasn't a TAFE to go to down the street, there wasn't somewhere where they could formally go and take a traditional form of learning. So what we've seen is this sort of mass movement towards online. Now, the other interesting factor to that is we were seeing trends like that pre-COVID. So in Australia, for example, more students started their online MBA or postgraduate degree than had done so by going to campus in the year of 2018. So you're now in a minority in Australia if you decide to do an MBA or a Masters of Education on campus. This was pre-COVID. So the world had started to be shifted towards online credentials, badges, and not going to campus anyway. What COVID has now done is just truly accelerate that. So I think it's a really interesting inflection point for, well, what is a traditional university and what do they now offer and how are they going to stay relevant to people who have found out that they don't have to go to our campus anymore to get their learning?
And look, I'd probably add to that then, what you'll see is competition between institutions will be based on ease of use for things like online platforms, and so suddenly that will become an important differentiator, when students are actually choosing where to study is just the quality of education that they can get through, that online.
Yeah, it's a really great point, James. In many ways, whilst the shift to online has been happening for education, the user experience and the quality of that experience hasn't come along with it. Yeah. So we've all shifted to Netflix over the last 6 months, and I've heard the line that everyone has completed Netflix, which is entirely true. But the user, and one of the reasons we've done so is the user experience is good. It's there, I can access it quickly, I can get what I want, I can choose it on my terms, it's available, it's got a good UX, it's nice and engaging. The online education experience doesn't quite follow suit. It's still a little bit clunky and it's built on sort of poor infrastructure. The experience isn't that great. It's built out of a bolt-on from the university experience. So it's going to have to get an awful lot better. And then the second point I think is fascinating is, has the level of competition intensified? So traditionally, we always thought to go to a university for, formal learning and accreditation. But nowadays, students have choice everywhere. I can go and learn how to do something on YouTube, or Google can teach me how to do something, or LinkedIn can get there, or I can get an industry professional to teach me. So this concept that we'll always go to a university for a formal accredited component of learning is evolving really quickly and right in front of our eyes.
And I think employers are catching up to that as well, where employers might have looked at only those traditional sort of maybe university things. I think employers are starting to recognize, other forms of learning as critical. I think it was KPMG last year actually took grads for the first time that didn't actually have a university degree. And so that just signifies that change in perception around, where you can get learning from.
It's a really good point. And we're an employer in this market and we work directly with universities, and as a business we've hired over 50 people since the beginning of March in a variety of different roles right across this country. I could not tell you where any single one of those people went to university, what course they did, or if even they went to university. I could not tell you. And I care greatly about the people we bring in and what they're going to add to us as a business. But I think this traditional mindset of, well, I'm going to evaluate someone on whether they went to Trinity or University of Melbourne or Queen's University is slowly slipping away for a lot of employers.
Yeah, look, I remember optimistically entering the workplace back in the 90s, which horrifies me sitting in 2020. But going to apply for jobs at the time, it was right. Well, did you go? In my context, I went to Queen's, and there was certain prestige to going to Queen's versus going to Jordanstown and UUJ, which is a great institution, and some would argue turns out more work ready individuals than that. But it was really around which university did you go to. A lot of the employers were looking for people who had went to the same place as they had, where they could recognize that they had done the same things as they had. And for a period, and it probably wasn't a great idea, they recruited mini versions of themselves and just tried to keep on that conveyor belt. That's gone, but I suspect there's a challenge for employers in terms of understanding the value and credibility of some of the learning experiences that people have had. So how, as an employer, would they be able to rank the Google learning versus LinkedIn versus a university delivered short course. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, yeah, the question of standards, especially around things like badges and micro-credentials, comes up quite often. How do you evaluate it if, you know, you've got two candidates and one's got a leadership badge from, say, University of Melbourne and another one's got a leadership badge from Google, for example. And so I think a standards framework needs to sort of be put in place for this. I also think a big part of it is time. If you look at sort of, you know, something like AWS certification, which in itself is, you know, a micro credential, eventually that was a nice to have for employers, but, you know, now it's seen as a critical, requirement for, you know, employment. So I think over time, employers and institutions working closely together to sort of identify, you know, I suppose important skills, and then having that recognition, throughout is important.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Look, there are clearly some areas, depending upon what you're hiring for or what the discipline you're in or what the industry you're working in, there are clearly some things that require a formal education and an accreditation and a qualification. If someone's going to be a social worker or a programmer or a psychologist, then, you know, they're not going to learn how to do that on YouTube, and no one's going to employ them as such. But there are other areas where, yeah, there are differing ways to, you know, build skills and for those to be recognized by employers. And we're seeing more and more of that. And I think one of the interesting sort of points that's coming into education now is recognition of skills. So the audience that we serve, so we serve close to 15,000 students across Australia right now. And the average, you boil those 15,000 down to one person, that's a 39-year-old female. So that 39-year-old female has maybe 15, 20 years worth of work experience. Whereas traditionally they were always evaluated on, well, what did you do at your undergraduate, 20 years ago? Or what did you study and what was your qualifications there? But she or he will have learned great skills and competencies and credentials through their work life. And they may have picked up small components of learning along the way. And what the sector is slowly starting to get better at, and James will absolutely recognize this, is recognizing those competencies, recognizing those things that she will have learned over the last 15 years and being able to formalize them, and then being able to create a bespoke learning path for her going forward, as opposed to saying, well, no, the traditional structure says you need to go back into a 2-year master's and you need to be able to take this before we recognize you. So we've come a long way there, and I think we've certainly a long way to go. But one other thing I did want to mention is that whilst there are absolute skills that industries need, and we want a software developer, or we want a psychologist, or we want a health unit manager, the other thing that industries are crying out for are just the very basic, and I'm loath to use the term soft skills because they're not soft skills. They're human-centered skills like leadership and communication and adaptability and teamwork and versatility. So especially in these times where things evolve so quickly, industry changes so greatly, and you have needs coming up on a daily basis. And one of the things we haven't done very well in this rush to create content and courses is ensure that those core vital skills that me as an employer or any industry wants are centered in the delivery of that content. So yes, you might be a great programmer, and yes, you might be able to write code for me better than anyone else. But if I can't trust you to communicate with the person sitting next to you, then do I really want you as an employee in my business? And that's one of the great things that I think, and certainly James, you'd be able to talk to this from a credential and the badging perspective, we have to ensure is ingrained in whatever courses or learning we start to deliver to people going forward, because especially in these crazy, crazy times, the ability for people to work independently, to work collaboratively, to be versatile, to critically analyze things is just as important as the technical skill we require them to have.
Look, yeah, and especially in times where we're going to see significantly higher unemployment, the competition between, candidates is going to increase, and it's going to be those candidates that can demonstrate the skills that you mentioned that are going to be sort of a bit ahead, and the greater the opportunity for them to potentially get a role if they can showcase.
We've had a couple of questions from from the audience. One, I think we kind of covered it around MBAs and the traditional sort of pecking order and ranking. Guys, do you see that becoming more challenged, or will those names and university brands effectively carry through?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. The majority of industry doesn't care where you got your MBA, or even if you have an MBA. And I say majority because there is of course there are of course still employers or roles where, if you're a legal firm, you want to hire someone that's done their Juris Doctor from a reputable university, as opposed to one they just picked up off the street. So there are places that will still value that as a priority, but I think it's diminished significantly over the last 5-10 years, and that's a good thing.
No, I'd agree with that as well.
Yeah, I literally just came from an interview prior to this, and I noticed in the candidate's resume that she had an MBA, and I directly came from, I could not tell you where she got that MBA from, and I was looking at her resume.
And I mean, you look at, now what I think, like what you raised with the human-centered side, when we employ, there's such a big component of it is how they're actually going to fit within the culture of our organization, as well as obviously having those underlying skills, but, what are they going to bring to the actual culture of the organization as well? We see that as one of the critical pieces when we're hiring new people.
One of the things that we've, I guess, been guilty of focusing on in our prep conversations and today has been around the consumer side. And we've got a really insightful question from the audience around the actual teacher. What does the industry need to do to support their successful transition and well-being into this environment? Because it's all well and good talking about the Netflix model and whatever. How do we bring the educators on this journey?
It's a really good question, and to Ryan's what he first said, that us as parents, I have a 7-year-old who's schooling for the first time, being Melbourne based, and he goes to a smaller school, and the teachers had never had any experience with presenting classes online, being able to actually put a course together, keep students interested. And it's interesting to see the evolution from the first lockdown to the second lockdown, because there was a lot of learning that they had in that time. I think if we don't support the kind of teachers and helping them move across to this different world, we are going to see, I suppose, a backward step in potentially the quality of the education. And just a quick example, first time around, they just tried to recreate in-class learning online, and it just really didn't work. Parents were frustrated, etc. The second time around, you can see the focus was more around some of the core competencies that the students needed to learn without replicating what the in-class learning is. And so trying to take a traditional sort of in-class model and just duplicating it online isn't going to work. And this is where I think that, teachers, educators are going to need that level of support.
Yeah, great question, Barry. So to give you a sense of, so we build just online degrees and have done so for 6 years alongside our university partners. And we invest a fortune into market research, product development, learning design, user experience, content, systems, technology delivery. And we make sure that product is as compelling, as engaging, as user-friendly, as aligned to industry as it possibly can be. And we do all that, and we know that the greatest correlation between student success and engagement is their relationship with their teacher and their facilitator or their tutor, whatever you want to call it. That is the most important characteristic of online learning. And I think back to 6 months ago, whenever the whole entire higher education sector had to shift online really quickly. We got a barrage of calls on a daily, weekly basis from institutions saying, can you help us put these courses online quickly? Can you help us, whether it's in whatever platform, whatever it needs to be? And a lot of our advice was, sure, that's one component of it, but have you thought about how you're going to help professionally develop the teachers and facilitators and lecturers so that they can deliver this content in an engaging fashion. Because, this is like, your house is on fire and you're really worried about, the upstairs curtains and that they look great and that they're in place, as opposed to thinking about getting the people out. So the focus or lack thereof around professional development for people in a new environment, whether it's my prep teacher who's teaching my 5-year-old or the university lecturers, hasn't been good enough. And I worry that this kind of, I'm sort of contradicting myself, this kind of Netflix model of education that we're all trying to follow still doesn't have the teacher at the heart of it. Because we think back to all our own experiences through education, and probably our best ones were when we had that great teacher who was able to, fundamentally explain something to us or engage us in an area of learning or excitement that was new to us. And we haven't quite done enough through that process. So as much as, great user experience and great support and a great platform and technology is in place, the teacher and the support for the teacher, who probably hasn't been given the development, the guidance and the support to be able to engage a cohort of online learners, give feedback appropriately in the right way, ensure that the content is relevant, follow up, participate in discussions the right way, assess in a different manner. All these things are materially different in an online environment than they are in a face-to-face classroom, and we've so much further to go in those spaces.
We've had another great question from the audience around some of the challenges on migration, and skills assessment and skills recognition is a key part of, for a lot of people, their application for a visa to Australia. And formal qualifications have traditionally been the way where you get your points and whatever. The process around recognition, assessment and recognition of skills that were maybe delivered in a less formal environment has been a big challenge. Some of the institutes have stepped in to provide that, but where can your businesses and businesses like yours bring this to the next step?
So in recognition of, I suppose, non-formal learning and helping get sort of a visa into Australia to either work or study, is that kind of the
yeah, so for those who their education journey has been less formal,
yeah,
and being able to present credentials well.
Yeah, happy to jump in there for a second. Catherine, I think I was just reading that question. Fantastic question. And the short and unfortunate answer is that governments will not do this anytime quickly. The standard method of recognizing qualification and therefore visa entry or relevance and pertinence to filling, supporting the national employment requirements, that won't change anytime soon. It'll be years before there's any substantive change to recognize credentials, accredited or unaccredited, as forms of competence in a particular area. Unfortunately. Now, I think what will happen a long time before that is that industry will recognize and employers will recognize non-accredited experience far quicker than as a degree of competence in something. A degree is probably the wrong term, but as a level of competence in a specific area. And you're already seeing that with, Jim's made the point around some of the big four accounting firms or Google or others who are prepared to look at differing forms of recognizing experience or expertise rather than necessarily a formal qualification. Now, how and when the government does that and is prepared to say, okay, you can be a nurse here because you have developed expertise in a different way than going through university, we're light years away from that.
And yeah, the only thing I would add is I think you're right. Even with the push to online learning with universities, it's going to be that regulation that's going to be the slowest part of that situation. Especially as a lot of universities are moving to online courses for international students. There are potentially international students who will complete a degree without actually trying to get that pathway to permanent residency. But again, that's going to, I think there's going to need to be some regulation changes there, et cetera, as well.
Sure. So ultimately, the change is going to be driven by industry and their willingness to embrace a different learning journey for potential employees. And I absolutely understand the terrible scenario for a lot of people at the minute in terms of unemployment and a more competitive job market going back. But it probably won't be too far into the future where the job market will become a little bit more skewed towards the employee, and they potentially will, people with good skills will have choice as to where they go and where they don't go. And I could see that becoming a competitive advantage in the employer's value proposition.
Absolutely. I mean, if you are recognizing that, that learning is outside traditional, then it definitely is going to be a competitive advantage, especially as more sort of younger students, migrate to different forms of learning. I think recognizing that, of course, would be a competitive advantage for those institutions, especially with bringing in new thinking, new skills, etc.
I think we've actually entered into a really interesting area, which is that tradition, as we've seen over the last few years, the pickup in online education has come from that more mature, what we call the working age learner, the 25 to 45-year-old, because the typical school leaver has gone to a university campus in the same way that probably the three of us did. Now, is that going to continue to happen, given that, one, campuses aren't open? Students were going to them less and less anyway. You look at sort of participation in lectures and people on campus, they were happening less and less. And then the international market, how long is it going to be before we can have people come to Australia on whatever class of visa? Like I heard our compatriot Alan Joyce this a couple of hours ago saying that no one's coming here on their planes for quite some time. So what does that mean for the school leaver, be they from Ballarat or Beijing, who may have been coming here previously and may have been thinking of the traditional form of 4 years of learning? Are they going to wait 18, 24 months before it's safe and comfortable to do so? Highly unlikely. They're going to have to take up their learning in some other shape or form. That's likely going to be online. It may be in shorter chunks. It may be driven by themselves. So I think this, we've talked a lot about this sort of online world and the mature learner who's kind of just accelerated in their own learning. But I'm really fascinated by what happens to the school leaver now, who had this traditional form and mindset of how they were going to learn, and their parent was pushing them towards, well, they're not coming here anytime soon, and they may not go through the same path again. So are we going to enter into a world whereby people now just take their learning and their university experience in an entirely different frame from what they've previously done?
Indeed. We have another great question from the audience around, given that 10% of the population suffer from dyslexia, do you foresee a growing market for literacy and learning development online?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. We have been for some time. This is, and not just students that suffer from learning difficulties or dyslexia, students that just feel more comfortable in an isolated environment, whether it be preference, whether it be a learning disability, whether it be a learning style. Online is very much a sort of panacea for an awful lot of that. So I know across our cohort of students, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students who have a learning disability, who are in a disadvantage, come from a disadvantaged background, and their preference for choosing online is it fits for them from either a learning style or a comfort perspective. So yeah, I don't see that slowing down at any point in time. And that's even said that I don't think the online experience has been created that well for them. I think there's an awful lot more we can do in order for, whether it's literacy deficiencies or learning and development challenges, we can make that experience a little bit better. We probably do an okay job at it right now, but I think there's so much more to go for students from disadvantaged or disabled backgrounds.
Does that then mean support becomes really, really important to students who are obviously studying online? And, we talk about competitive advantage. If you've got two courses, one has a stronger level of support to people who might have learning difficulties, that I assume becomes critical.
Yeah, very true.
I'm conscious of time. I said it would be about sort of 30, 40 minutes. We're 1:36 at the minute. So just to sort of bring us towards the latter stages of the conversation. The future, the crystal balls. You guys have been at the cutting edge and the bleeding edge of development in the sector. What are the problems that you're seeing at this point that we're going to have to solve in the future? What's coming down the line?
Look, I think, there's quite a few things, and look at the reliance on international students, I think is, one of the things that we have seen with universities in Australia. And, obviously students can't, obviously come here. We've got students on the ground that, that are studying but don't have jobs, so I think this in the future, this idea is supporting, the international learners, but also the budget cuts and staffing cuts that have impacted universities to offer that support. The budget cut also goes into a way of potentially limiting the innovation that universities can do, as we've had to look at sort of some of the relationships that we've had and look at creative ways to be able to introduce new products, new features, because the universities themselves, their budgets have been significantly cut, and that impacts that ability to potentially innovate.
Yeah, I certainly don't have a crystal ball, and there are all manner of variables that are going to come into play, which will impact how and where education goes. But I'd say the two principal ones that we as a sector need to think seriously about are exactly James's point, that this is, from a higher education perspective, this is a sector that was not prepared for something like this at all. And what we've done subsequently is take more away from them. So we're funding them less, we're impacting their budgets, we're taking away their ability to be in any form agile. So they weren't ready for it, we've taken more away from them. So this kind of thought process that we're going to be in a better state in 12 or 24 months' time is completely flawed to me. And then secondly, at the same time as more coming away, consumer demand is growing. So whilst everyone is somewhat empathetic that, yes, we're having to throw together mad Zoom sessions or team sessions and remote learning very, very quickly, and people recognize that there was a sort of a quick emergency response to delivery, that patience is going to wear thin. People's expectations are going to get higher. Well, if I'm paying $40,000 for a degree, or if I'm sending my 5-year-old to, a school at an elite institution and I'm paying $35,000 a year, then my expectations are going to get greater. So this kind of divergence of, well, we're taking more away from the sector, whilst at the same time consumers' expectations are getting greater, I think are going to create a really, really scary divergence at some point in time, and we're going to have to think seriously about how we either fund the sector or how we reset expectations for what education is going to look like.
So, in terms of the links to all things Irish Australian, James, one of the things that we picked up on was you guys had a partnership with DCU. Around an institute for digital learning. What's that all about, and how does it feed into what we're seeing at the minute?
Look, again, it goes back to the discussion around badges and the agreement with DCU. They're actually going to start issuing badges to their learners, and so for short courses, etc. Obviously the soft skills, etc. We see that as the first opportunity amongst that group of institutions, and we're going to work together on sort of promoting, kind of the badges and micro credentials, in the market. The other interesting component was DCU also saw the value of learners actually having that single repository for all of their digital credentials, so when they are actually, going to market, again, they've got that single repository where they can share, all of the learning there. Very similar to what we've done in Australia with My Equals, Australia and New Zealand. We now have 11 of the Australian publicly funded universities also signed up for digital badges. and they'll start issuing badges in the new year. So I think, this shows that universities are seeing the benefit of badges, and especially with the support from government as well, looking at helping to fill a lot of those sort of gaps in the market.
Ryan, you described the sort of typical customer for Keypath earlier. We've talked about how the funding models might change. Do you see a scenario where employers, rather than just go out shopping for new people all the time, when they've got people who are the right cultural fit, will start to maybe invest more in developing the skills for the people that they have who really fit into their businesses, and that employer funding may start to sustain some of the innovation and development?
That's a really, really good question, Barry. And to date, especially in Australia, we haven't seen a really prevalent employer-funded education model. And certainly, if you compare it to US, North America, or some other, or even China, some other parts of the world, where the employers, beyond just sort of setting a budget and setting some focus towards learning development, truly bring it into the heart of sort of engaging and empowering their employees. We certainly haven't seen anything like that at scale in Australia anytime, outside of maybe a handful of institutions or the top percentage of industries who do so, or employers who do so. I think that will and does need to happen. Now, when we get out, if we get out of this world where unemployment is at sky high levels, it's going to be really incumbent upon employers to figure out, well, how do I keep these people who spent the last 2 years, improving themselves from a professional development and an education perspective? What is it about us as an employer that's going to be able to attract and retain employees? And I think prospective employees, I know this myself, are certainly going to become a lot more emboldened around asking questions around, well, how are you going to develop me, and what track record have you got around retaining, engaging, and improving employee development, learning, and well-being? I don't think we have really taken that as a sector in Australia that seriously, and we haven't really bridged the gap between employer and university and outcomes perspective. So whether more dollars goes towards this, whether this is a sort of mindset we need to improve as a country, I think it's certainly something we'll see an awful lot more of. I know across our student body, nearly every one of those students makes their own decision themselves as an independent student or an independent consumer. I'm taking charge of my own learning by going and taking an MBA or a Master's of Social Work or a Master of Education, whatever it might be. And very few are funded by their employer to do so. And yet when you delve into the detail of that, more than likely their employer has set aside through some budget dollars for them for training and development. It just, they haven't either accessed it, utilized it, or they haven't taken it on a sort of holistic basis.
I agree with the perception point, because you think of a lot of employees who start to do development. I think there's always a perception that they need to move on to be able to benefit from that that work, and as you said, they're funding it themselves. They're probably thinking about their next job outside your company, and you get into this kind of 2-year cycle where people stay with an employer for 2 years and think that the only way they can actually get that next step up is leaving the organization. And that drain, I think, is something that, that we're thinking about. How do we make sure that we are continuing to gauge our employees and make them feel that there is a pathway to something better?
It reminds me of that sort of internal joke between executives of a business who say, well, if we invest this money in our people, will they leave? And the answer is, well, what happens if we don't invest in them and they stay?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and way back in the dim and distant past, back in the late 90s, I did a bit of work around some exec search, and the people who would be interested in having a conversation about another opportunity weren't the people who, well, you'd always get people who hated their boss and thought, they should earn twice as much as they did. But generally, the best people were interested in a move because the learning curve was starting to flatten. The challenge was reducing, the opportunity to be challenge developed for that personal growth and stimulation was absolutely the reason that people were looking elsewhere. So it's a smart investment when you think about it. If you've gone to the trouble of finding the person, they fit the business, and they need to have that growth and development opportunity. As long as the business can sustain it, I mean, why would you not?
Yeah, I'll finish with one point. So Coursera, which is probably the largest platform of learners around the world, they've added 35 million enrollments on their platform since March. So 35 million. This is larger than the population of Australia and Ireland combined. And the number one course interest across that entire platform was personal development. Ahead of business, computer programming, management, leadership, humanities, data science, the number one was personal development. So your employees are doing this already. So this kind of concept or this thought process that we need to go and invest in our people, or we need to think about their professional development, they're already doing that. You're already losing them.
Yeah. And it's interesting how when there are budget cuts, it's usually training and development that is one of the first things that a company actually cuts, right? So
yeah, when I moved to Australia in 2006, I had a startup business in learning and development, and it was going great until the global financial crisis kicked in, and every business wiped learning and development from their budget, and my business fell apart in the space of 6 months. So yeah, I worry that we're seeing the same cycle again, 10, 12 years later.
Yeah, it wouldn't be unknown for a new leadership team to come into a business and say, all right, let's get rid of HR, let's get rid of marketing, for two very different reasons, but neither, I would argue, are sensible moves. Gentlemen, thank you very much for taking a bit of time out of your very busy days. I told you 30, 40 minutes, we're just about 50, so I owe you 10 minutes back over a beer sometime whenever we're allowed to go out. But in the meantime, I wish you the best of luck with your ventures. What you're doing is actually having an impact within business and in education. It's going to be a really interesting story to see how we can support those educators on the journey that we're on, and look forward to your continued success. So on behalf of our audience and the Chamber, thanks for a great discussion.